skins following his breach of coronavirus protocols. He'd already been fined $40,000 and stripped of his captaincy after being filmed at a party without a face covering, as has Neymar as well. He's been organising a party. We'll be hearing about that later on in the programme. More sport online on the brilliant BBC Sport website as ever.
James, thank you very much indeed. Newsday BBC.
Liga, European Champions League, and of course individual awards like the Ballon d'Or multiple times.
Thank you for having me. Well, it was a bold very active and is spreading its reach beyond areas where the group traditionally is based. That's in northern Borno and part of central Borno.
Yeah, and it was horrific, wasn't it? We read that fighters rode into Pemi, which is in Borno State, on trucks and motorbikes. They shot indiscriminately. There was a lot of looting. There was a priest that was kidnapped. People died. And Pemi, of course, is close to Jabuk, where the 200 schoolgirls were kidnapped back in 2014. This group is a splinter, isn't it, from the Islamic State group? Tell us a little bit about them. That they are pretty well equipped, aren't they?
Exactly, like you stated, it's the splinter faction of Boko Haram, which has been in Boko Haram, attacking communities and security forces since 2009. However, this group split out of Boko Haram in 2016 and was predominantly operating in northern Borno and central Borno, while the Boko Haram, the Shekau-led Boko Haram, with most predominantly in southern Borno, it keeps attacking communities, exactly where Chibok is. And Chibok has always been under attack from Boko Haram, but recently, in the past few months, we have seen Islamic State West African province coming really deep into this region where Boko Haram has traditionally continued to attack. The attack was devastating. They burnt public facilities, schools, looted medical supplies, burned ambulances, and also targeted churches, multiple churches in different communities, both in Adamawa and Borno State.
Well, what is it about this group then that Boko Haram wasn't enough for them? I mean, Boko Haram literally means Western education is forbidden. It forbids Muslims from taking part in activity not derived from Islamic tradition. What more did they want to achieve?
Well, for them, it's about creating a caliphate, a state, an area where they control, where they exact their own interpretation of Islam. They're much more military in terms of their military capacity than Boko Haram, and that's why they pose a serious threat. Even the same thing with the Boko Haram, but this group has shown that it has more capacity to attack security forces than the parent Boko Haram group. And so generally, their idea is to just establish a caliphate in the region, control the people, control the population, control the geographical area.
Good to talk to you, Matala. Thank you for the update. Matala Abdullahi there. He is a security reporter for the news website Hum Angle.
6 minutes to the hour. This is Newsday with Lawrence and Claire. We're going to hear now from Ibrahim Omer, born in Eritrea, who's just become New Zealand's first MP from Africa. As a former refugee, he has a remarkable story to tell, as you'd imagine. Forced to flee as a teenager, eventually ended up literally on the other side of the world. He was elected to Parliament in New Zealand in November, and Mauricio Olmedo Perez caught up with him in Wellington in New Zealand and heard about his remarkable journey from Eritrea to the Parliament in New Zealand.
I will be on your side and fight alongside you. Norera, tena koto, tena koto, tena tato katoa.
A flood of tears and a standing ovation for an Eritrean Kiwi delivering his maiden speech in Parliament. Ibrahim Omar made it into government after Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party won a landslide election.
It's hard to put it into words.
I meet him in the debating chamber where he made his speech that went viral.
Earlier I was quite nervous because I didn't practice enough. I did not expect in my wild dreams to have an impact that it did. Someone like me, only 5 years ago I was a cleaner.
We'll come back to that cleaning soon. First, back to his roots in the Eritrean capital of Asmara, where he grew up in what he describes as a happy, traditional Muslim family.
I used to get in trouble all the time because I spent so much time playing soccer. But at the same time, I always loved reading.
He also had a love for languages, 6 in fact, including English, which he taught himself. And it was those language skills which would shape his future in ways he could never have imagined. In the 1990s, war broke out between Eritrea and its neighbour Ethiopia. Ibrahim was in his final year at high school and was conscripted, sent to the front line to train, and when he finished, he narrowly avoided combat as a truce was declared.
People who left the training camp 2-3 weeks earlier, where some of them died, my friends, some of them severely disabled.
But he was still in danger. With political instability and internal conflicts becoming violent, many in the army were deserting. He was threatened by a superior to give information on some of his comrades who'd escaped, but he refused.
And that's when I started thinking, okay, I don't have any future in this country.
Ibrahim made the huge decision to also desert, going into hiding for 8 months before being smuggled across the border to Sudan. Presenting himself to the Sudanese authorities, he entered a refugee camp where he got himself a life-changing break, working as a translator for the UN Refugee Agency. But when Sudan itself fell into conflict, his interpreting work saw him accused of being a spy, and he was arrested.
Interrogation, often they come in the night and intimidate me and tell us, who do you guys spy for?
He was detained for almost 6 months, until one day he pretended to be sick and was taken to a hospital where he managed to alert the UN of his whereabouts. Released on bail, he faced deportation back to Eritrea, so he sought refugee status in another country.
And that's when New Zealand was looking for some cases, and they came to interview people. The first thing given to them was my case, and got interviewed.
What did you know about New Zealand?
Nothing. I didn't know. I didn't know the country exists.
So, in 2008, Ibrahim was on a plane to the bottom of the world to live in New Zealand's capital, Wellington. He worked 2 full-time jobs, 80 hours a week, to save enough for fees. The night before he started uni, he was there well before any other student because he was cleaning the same theatre that he would later be sitting in for his first lecture as a political studies student.
Finished at 4 o'clock, slept for about 4 hours. 10 o'clock was my first lecture. Spent 20 minutes just lost in thought. I had a small notebook, all these young students with flash laptops and quite intimidating, but to me it was just a dream that came true.
He began campaigning for the Labour Party as a volunteer and got involved with trade unions, fighting for the rights of cleaners and other low-paid professionals. Ibrahim's hard work was finally rewarded when he was listed as a candidate for Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party in the upcoming election.
And I consider the Labour Party to be deeply privileged and lucky to now have Ibrahim as a candidate for us.
You heard Ibrahim Omar there. That was Jacinda Ardern paying tribute to him. His maiden speech, very emotional maiden speech, is very, very visible online. It kind of went viral, and rightly so. So Ibrahim Omar speaking there to Mauricio Olmedo Perez in Wellington.
This is the BBC World Service. How did a 19-year-old Indian student cause a sensation in Wales?
1914, the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth. An annual competition is being held celebrating Welsh culture. The top prize given to the best poet. So how did a 19-year-old Indian student become the first woman and non-European to win it?
The Hindu Bard. Today at 9:20 GMT. And at 8:30 GMT, Business Daily.
We'll be asking how our eating habits have changed during a year when lockdowns have seen more of us cooking at home and fewer of us sharing meals out with colleagues. And can Zoom calls replace the networking coffee or dinner?
Now we return to Newsday here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome. This is Newsday from the BBC World Service with Claire MacDonald and Lawrence Pollard.
Hello, thanks for joining us. President-elect Joe Biden hits out at President Trump, saying US security has suffered enormous damage at the hands of the Trump administration, and he claims his team isn't getting the information it needs to make its transition to power.
Also, we'll be talking about Argentina, whether it'll become the first major country in mainly Roman Catholic South America to legalise abortion. There's a very important Senate vote later.
And as US coronavirus cases continue to surge, a key source of infection is thought to be prisons. New figures show more than 1,700 prisoners have died of COVID-19.
I felt like I was going to die. I couldn't breathe. My chest was caving in. Nobody really wants to have any contact with us. And it's just like they treated us like we were dogs.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. Republicans in the US House of Representatives have joined Democrats to reject President Trump's veto of a defense bill. The Senate will vote on the measure on Tuesday and could, with a two-thirds majority, override for the first time Mr. Trump's use of the veto in the final weeks of his presidency. Julian Bedford reports.
It's been a humiliating 24 hours for Mr. Trump. First under pressure from inside and outside his administration, he signed the coronavirus stimulus package. Then the House showed rare unity to override his veto of the sprawling defense bill. Mr. Trump had objected to, amongst other things, clauses stripping the names of Confederate generals from military bases. Attention now switches to the Senate, which on Tuesday could deliver the first reverse of a presidential veto of the Trump term.
Earlier, President-elect Joe Biden had said his team was not getting enough information regarding national security issues. The House of Representatives also voted to increase the aid to individuals under the latest coronavirus stimulus package. The increase from $600 to $2,000 was suggested by President Trump, but his Republican Party opposed it. The Bangladeshi Navy says an operation has begun to ferry a further 1,800 Rohingyas to a low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal. 7 ships are moving the refugees to their new home, and Barasan Etarajan reports.
Bhashan Char is a remote island located about 60 kilometers off the coast of Bangladesh. The authorities say they have built housing units, hospitals and schools there for the Rohingya. But aid groups say the island is exposed to cyclones and prone to flooding. They also say some of the refugees have been forced to move. But the Bangladeshi authorities claim the Rohingya wanted to leave the overcrowded camps where they have lived since fleeing ethnic violence in Myanmar. Bangladesh wants to relocate about 100,000 refugees to the island. It says the facilities on Bhashan Char are much better.
The British Ministry of Defence says military personnel will be deployed to support the implementation of coronavirus testing in English schools and colleges. Britain has seen the rate of new infections increase rapidly, driven in part by a new, more infectious strain. With more details, here's Catherine Stancheshan.
A total of 1,500 armed forces personnel are being made available. They'll form local response teams, providing predominantly remote advice to schools, although some will be deployable in person if needed. The government has said a safe return to school for pupils and teachers amid rising coronavirus cases would be built on an effective testing system. But some teaching unions think schools simply haven't been given enough time to prepare.
World news from the BBC. Prosecutors in New York City have launched an investigation into a confrontation between a black man and a white woman who falsely accused his teenage son of stealing her phone as they passed in a hotel lobby. In a video posted online by Keon Harold, a prominent jazz trumpeter, the unidentified woman demands Mr. Harold's son return her phone. According to Mr. Harold, an Uber driver returned the phone to the woman shortly after the incident. Prince Charles has told the BBC he now sees the private sector as a critical part of the solution to climate change. The heir to the British throne said that in the past 18 months there had been a change of approach among firms as they recognised what he called the real emergency the world now faced.
It's the private sector, which has in many ways contributed to the problem over the past century, is now in fact a necessary and critical part of the solution. And I haven't been wasting my time during this ghastly pandemic in having more and more video round tables and Zoom calls. And suddenly we're finding engagement on a scale I would never have believed.
Health officials in South Korea are struggling to contain a third wave of the the COVID-19 virus, having recorded the country's highest daily death toll since the pandemic began. While numbers remain low in global terms, 40 deaths in 24 hours, South Korea has so far avoided a lockdown, relying instead on targeted measures to try to limit the spread of the infection. Tributes have been paid to the renowned Mexican singer-songwriter Armando Manzanero, who died on Monday at the age of 85. Famed for his romantic ballads, Manzanero was the first Mexican to receive a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Many of his lyrics were translated into English and recorded by international artists, including Andrea Bocelli, Placido Domingo and Frank Sinatra. BBC News.
Thanks for the latest. Hello, this is Newsday from the BBC World Service with Claire and Lawrence. Claire standing by to talk the latest comments by President-elect Joe Biden on security, saying he's not getting the help he needs. Also, we'll be hearing whether Argentina could be about to legalise abortion, which would be a big deal in predominantly, dominatedly Catholic Latin America. And also a report on how prisons in the US appear to be one of the major cluster hotspots for coronavirus outbreaks. We have a report from the inside. All that plus the sport and the business. That's Newsday.
Let's start with President-elect Joe Biden. He has hit out at the Trump administration, saying he isn't getting the access he needs to crucial information ahead of the transition period. Let's take a listen to what he's been saying.
We've encountered roadblocks from the political leadership at the Department of Defense and the Office of Management and Budget. Right now, we just aren't getting all the information that we need from the outgoing administration in key national security areas. It's nothing short, in my view, of irresponsibility.
Well, I've been talking to Lisa Hagan about this. She is a political reporter for US News covering US Congress.
It's not entirely surprising given that President Donald Trump is still unwilling to acknowledge that he, in fact, lost the presidency. And it's kind of, we're hearing these conflicting messages of who's actually sharing the right information, if enough is being given to the Biden team. So a little bit of friction just about 3 weeks out from a change in power over here.
So what is he talking about specifically? What are the areas of concern? I mean, he seems to be saying lots of deployments, lots of agencies have been hollowed out. He clearly wants to rebuild those. But when it comes to international security, what do they need to know that they're not being told?
He's been highlighting over the past few weeks the massive cyber attack that hit the U.S. And so it hit U.S. businesses, it hit agencies, it hit the Treasury Department. And so I can't say for sure if he's not getting those full briefings on that, but this is of obvious national security concern to him. So whether or not he's getting full briefings on that, the right information, any documents, that's top of mind for him right now, given that they still are trying to figure out what exactly happened and who's responsible, even though they've indicated that they believe it's Russia.
And when he says his team need a clear picture of our false posture around the world and that US adversaries could exploit any confusion that resulted, I mean, that seems pretty basic, doesn't it? To have that information, to know who is where, what their strength is. Is that pretty unprecedented in your experience?
I would say so. It's typical that when someone loses the presidency, this period of time is called a lame duck, basically before the next president is installed and a new session of Congress is being seated. It's this period of time where it's a normal transition of power. It is what President Barack Obama did for now President Donald Trump, extending that courtesy to him, despite the two of them not having that great of a relationship. And so it's pretty odd to not be giving them the transition of power that every single outgoing president gives to their successor. And I think Biden made the point in terms of framing this from a global standpoint that he's arguing that U.S. allies and a lot of countries around the world don't respect the U.S. like they used to. And so for him, he is eager in his mind to get what he believes is back on track with the U.S. and its allies. And by not getting whatever information he is said to not be getting, puts him more at a disadvantage when he's about to take office on January 20th.
Well, we are 3 weeks out from that. So what are the potential pitfalls? Could there be serious fallout from this? Do you think this is why he stepped in now and gone public, clearly with his frustration, the President-elect Joe Biden? He's clearly concerned of what might happen just in those 3 weeks.
Right. What he calls vacuum of power right now. I mean, just not being able to have critical information, even what might seem small when it comes to being a national security risk, that is something that he would want to be able to have on day one. The U.S. just faced what seems to be a domestic attack, a Christmas Day bombing in Nashville, Tennessee. So I think the country's a little bit on the edge right now. And so wanting a full picture of where we are, both domestically and globally, is something that is chief and top in his mind right now. And so I think he just wants to go in on day one, having a full picture. Whether or not it actually does set us back in any kind of way is to be determined, but he at least wants to be fully prepared when he steps in on January 20th.
Lisa Hagan there. She's a political reporter for Congress for US News.
Let's talk about abortion in Argentina. In the wider region in Latin America, abortion is very, very hard to come by. You get 40 years in some countries for seeking an abortion. Just 2 years ago, the Senate in Argentina rejected an attempt to legalize abortion, but now the issue is back for a vote. It looks very tight. That's why campaigners from both pro-choice and anti-abortion campaigns are expected to converge on the Argentinian Senate later today. That is when the vote is expected. The bill's already been approved in the lower house. The Senate's seen as more conservative. And if it passes, then Argentina would be the first major country in South America to legalize abortion. And Carolina Orloff joins us now, an Argentinian. Happens to, at the moment, be living and working in Britain, but following events closely. Carolina, welcome to the show. How closely are you following this from abroad, therefore?
Well, good morning. Thanks very much for having me. Very closely, I'm following this very closely, not just as an Argentinian, but a woman, as a human being. In general, this is very big news for everybody, I think.
And just explain. I mean, 2 years ago, it was rejected by the Senate. We've seen some countries obviously go down the route of taking sort of national referendums on this. This is still going through the parliamentary route instead. What do you think has changed in the past 2 years, and more widely in the past decade or so, in Argentinians' attitudes towards abortion?
Well, I think a lot has changed in the society in terms of how the debate, the questions has seeped into everybody's mind. In terms of how important it is for the state to protect women and girls in terms of not just their individual rights, reproductive rights, but also in terms of their general need for health care and health protection. I think, as you said in your introduction, it's very important to bear in mind and to remind the listeners that this is not just about an individual choice as a woman about what you'd like to do with your own body and whether you want to pursue motherhood or not. This is more importantly, I think, and this is what's at stake. It's about the need to stop criminalizing women and girls who not just have an abortion or opt to have an abortion, but sometimes have a miscarriage. Women are being sent to prison for having a miscarriage.
That actually seems, just outrageous. I think anyone would accept that. I mean, is that the sort of thing that grabs popular attention? Because often the arguments around this, they can be conceptual, but also there's often individual cases, anonymous or otherwise, which really cut through. Can you think of ones in the Argentinian experience that have done that?
Absolutely, yes. Of course, there are many. Within those many, these are only a few that end up catching the national and international press, and also the attention of international organizations such as Amnesty and the UN. But not so long ago, in fact, in 2017, there was a case that caught a lot of attention of a girl, of a woman in her 20s that named herself Belen to protect her identity. And she was from the northern province of Tucumán, which tends to be more conservative, as opposed to somewhere like the city, Buenos Aires. And she just was suffering very strong abdominal pains, took herself to the public hospital. She was unaware that she was pregnant. She found out that she was pregnant there and then, had a miscarriage. And while all this was happening, someone within the hospital reported her to the authorities, and she was very quickly sentenced to 8 years imprisonment for aggravated murder. So that's how shocking it can be.
I mean, that's the kind of story that would change anyone's mind. I mean, one interesting thing is that Christina de Kirchner, who was president not that long ago, she was actually against legalizing abortion, but now she's changed her mind. Do you think that there is a big enough political change to actually swing the Senate vote? Because many people are saying it's going to be very, very tight.
Yes, well, it was tight in the lower house a few weeks ago, but it was passed. And now the feeling is that it's going to be tight, but because Alberto Fernandez, the current president, is backing the bill, that there's a positive feeling that the bill will come through, but it will be tight. It will be very tense. We will have to wait till probably the wee hours of tomorrow morning till we know the results. But if it's not today, if it's not tonight, it's just a matter of time.
It's coming, you reckon? No,
it's
okay.
Absolutely.
Carolina,
no
many thanks indeed. Carolina Orlov, as you heard, watching very closely that vote in the Argentinian Senate in a few hours' time on moves to legalise abortion. Thank you to Carolina.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Headlines today. The House of Representatives has voted to reject Donald Trump's veto of a defence bill, raising the possibility that the president could, for the first time, see his powers limited in the final weeks of his term. The Bangladeshi Navy is transporting another 1,800 refugees to a flood-prone island in the Bay of Bengal. And the British military is being sent into English schools to help test pupils for coronavirus. James Gregg is here with the sport.
Yes, COVID outbreaks causing real problems in the Premier League. Manchester City's Premier League match at Everton last night was postponed 4 hours before kick-off because of an outbreak of coronavirus around the training ground and at the club. Everton said that they would be requesting full disclosure of the information City provided to the Premier League that led to that postponement. When are they going to get all those mismatches played? Elsewhere, Chelsea, meanwhile, dropped more points last night. 4 points from 5 matches now. Bit of pressure on Frank Lampard. They're in 6th place. There's 5 matches later on in the Premier League as well. Legendary Lionel Messi has once again hinted that he could leave Barcelona in June when his contract ends to head to the United States of America. He loves putting himself in the news. I'll be talking to somebody in about half an hour's time for more on that. And the LA Lakers lost to the Portland Trail Blazers in the NBA, 115-107, second loss in the first 4 games of the season for the reigning champions. Everything sporty continues from me in 30 minutes' time.
And James, briefly, I know you're going to be digging into this Neymar party. He had a Christmas party, apparently, to which lots of people were invited. Bit of a backlash he's on the receiving end of now.
Yes, lots of sort of mixed reports. It's meant to be a several day long party that he's holding, obviously breaking lots of the social distancing rules, and it's caused a real stir in Brazil, especially when a lot of people are praising him for his sort of newfound maturity. But I've spoken to Tim Vickery. I'll be hearing more from him in around an hour and a half's time, something like that, on the programme. It's really interesting, well worth a listen.
Excellent. James, thank you.
19 minutes past the hour. Now let's get the business. Andrew Wood is here with the latest, not the final latest, but the latest on Brexit. Andrew.
Yeah, it's taken us 4.5 years to get here since the referendum in the UK. Well, the UK Parliament actually voted on the deal yesterday. European Union officials are discussing the deal agreed with the UK. Remember, that was last week. It's a big change for businesses. And joining us now is Ben Butters. He's Chief Executive of Eurochambers. That's a trade body which represents more than 20 million businesses in Europe. Good morning, Mr. Butters. First question, I'd say, are those 20 million businesses all in the European Union, or are some of them in the UK as well?
None of them are in the UK, but they're not all in the European Union. The vast majority certainly are, but we have members in a number of countries neighbouring the European Union, but no, not the UK.
So your members are actually going, when they want to do business with the UK from next year, they're going to have to start doing things like filling in forms for the first time. Do they remember how to do that? It's been so long since the UK joined the common market.
Well, that's a very important point, and in fact, for many businesses, it's not a question of remembering, because they will never have done it. Businesses that have been created in the last couple of decades, particularly smaller businesses which typically trade in their close geographic area, will never have completed a customs declaration form or the various other pieces of paperwork that will now be required before in the existence of their company. So it's really uncharted waters for them.
Does that mean that they will just stop doing business with the UK because it becomes too difficult, do you think?
I think that really depends on each business, but for some, yes, I believe that would be the conclusion. For the majority, though, they will, from the feedback we're hearing, continue doing business with the UK. In many cases, they're not trading directly with the UK, but are part of supply chains that are linked to the UK, and yes, they will continue to do so. We're still a little unclear about the precise requirements that will be needed and the procedures that will be put in place both on the EU side and the UK side. So there's a little bit of uncertainty remaining, but at least there's relief that we've avoided the threat of tariffs.
Okay, I better just correct myself there. Parliament actually, of course, in the UK is going to be called on the 30th to vote on this, not last week, not this week. My apologies there. Anyway, Benjamin Butters at the Eurochambers, a trade body which represents more than 20 million people, businesses across Europe. Thanks very much for joining us on Newsday.
Thank you to Andrew Wood with the business news.
We've been bringing you a picture this morning on Newsday of how coronavirus is surging across the world. We've been to South Korea, South Africa, and let's go to the States now. Coronavirus cases continue to surge there too. A key source of infection is in prisons. New figures from the Criminal Justice Campaign Group, the Marshall Project, show more than 1,700 prisoners have died of COVID-19, and 1 in 5 has tested positive for the virus. The BBC has been given access to telephone recordings with female inmates who are currently incarcerated at a women's prison in Michigan. Gabriella Pomeroy reports.
In the beginning of COVID-19, I thought that this was something that wouldn't reach us. I thought that I was fairly safe in prison.
When the first coronavirus case came to the Women's Huron Valley Prison, inmate Tamara Washington wasn't too worried.
And then it hit us. And once it hit us, it became real. A couple friends got really sick. We had a couple deaths here. And the fear and the reality of it all was just a lot. It was a lot of despair.
Tamara's talking there to a phone helpline which is run by the American Friends Service Committee Michigan and helps people inside navigate the prison system. Since March, the phone line has been inundated with calls from inmates fearful of the coronavirus ripping through their facilities. One of the first deaths at Huron Valley was Sue Farrell, in prison for murdering her husband after years of domestic abuse.
My bunkie, Sue Farrell, she was 73 years old. She didn't have no symptoms until the day she passed.
That's Chelsea Roundhouse, who called the prison wardens for help as her cellmate Sue was gasping for breath.
She went to the desk and told the desk that she was having a sore throat, that she wasn't feeling well. They told her to go lie down, that they were going to call healthcare. 9:05 passed by. I looked into my room, and it appeared as my bunkie was having a stroke. Her arms were in the air, and she was pale white, and it looked like she was, like, trying to scream, but she was just making, like, mumbling noises. Healthcare came to her with an oxygen tank, and by then she had already passed. I watched her take her last breath, and I seen her carry her body away.
3 days after Chelsea's cellmate died of coronavirus, Chelsea was moved into a prison unit with dozens of other inmates who quickly complained that she might infect them and had her removed. There are nearly 2,000 women at Huron Valley Prison, but campaigners say it's overcrowded.
We ended up catching it because we don't have that social distancing space. We have 16-man cells, 10-man cells, we have 4-man cells, and that's just not possible when they're in rooms that are built like a closet.
Reith McIntosh is serving a minimum 5-year sentence, and she caught coronavirus earlier this year.
I was very scared when I was told that I was positive. I felt like I was going to die. I couldn't breathe. My chest was caving in. I had a temperature of 102.5. My heart rate was 135. Nobody really wants to have any contact with us. And it's just like they treated us like we were dogs.
The prison was running out of spaces to quarantine people, so they transferred the positive cases to a disused warehouse on the prison grounds.
My name is Jakara Moore, and I'm serving an 8-year sentence at Woman Huron Valley Correctional Facility. There was about like 20, 30 beds back there, and they were just filling them up. Then it would get so hot in there to the point that people couldn't breathe. We didn't have no window to open or anything like that. So we had to beg to get like juice and fruit like that, and we had to fight tooth and nail just to get a Tylenol.
We have put these testimonies to the Michigan Department of Corrections, which runs the facility. A spokesman says it is not overcrowded, medical staff are available, and that the women got fruit and juice with their meals, but their request for extra was denied. For inmates like Tamara, coping with life behind bars has become even harder as the routine of prison life has changed.
For the most part, I stay in my cell. We no longer get visits. Our phone calls are minimized. The gym was my thing. It was like my favorite thing to do in prison. The gym is shut down. And it's like there's no relief. There's no outlet. Everybody was hurting and everybody dealing with things on their own. And so I try to find happiness in religion, seeking that out, getting closer to my higher power. It's like trying to get readjusted to this new normal of nothing. It's a lot of nothing, so it's more sleep. It's a lot of isolation. And it's like that's all I really have now, sleep and isolation.
Tamara Washington then, a woman currently serving 10 years in a Michigan prison, on how COVID-19 has changed life for prisoners on the inside there. That report from Gabriella Pomeroy. We have to tell you, a prison spokesman said the temperature in the quarantine building was appropriate for the current climate and that the inmates in quarantine had a TV and games and more to occupy them than the general prison population. So that's what they are saying on that. We're asking you today, what have you been doing during lockdown? Because we're going to hear an incredible story in the next hour, Lawrence. A young boy called Max Woozy. He was inspired by his elderly neighbour, Rick. He's here in the UK. And this neighbour, Rick, gave him a tent shortly before he died. He gave him the tent and he said to this young boy, "Promise me you'll have an adventure with it." And so from that moment on, as soon as the pandemic hit, he has camped in his back garden every single night. We've had a major storm in the UK just a couple of days ago, Storm Bella. He's been out there the whole time raising money for the hospice that his neighbour went into and his neighbour's wife went into as well. He's raised around £100,000, which is incredible, 135,000 US dollars. That's what he's been doing in lockdown. Delighted to say we're going to be speaking to Max on Newsday in the next hour, so stay with us. Lawrence and Claire with you. News is next.
This is the BBC World Service. looking at climate change.
A climate study endorsed by 11,000 scientists warns there'll be untold human suffering unless...
The message is stark.
These aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science.
Climate change is affecting people across the world.
In Phoenix, it is hot all the time, during the day and during the night. This heat is not normal.
A fourth of Bangladesh has been affected by the floods. We have more than 15,000 people displaced.
We've got fires that are still burning, transforming landscapes, wiping out wildlife.
So how do we face these challenges?
Each week we'll talk to our journalists on the ground and hear how the crisis is unfolding right in front of their eyes.
And we'll bring together leading experts to hear how we might make a better future.
Join Neil Rizal and Greer Jackson for The Climate Question, Monday at 9:20 GMT.
Hello, welcome. You're listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service. Lawrence Pollard and Claire MacDonald with you.
On the way, we ask why Sudan is preparing to send large numbers of troops to South Darfur.
Also, we're talking to the UN about what's happening to hundreds of Syrian refugees after their camp in Lebanon was burnt down at the weekend.
And what Brexit means in terms of British students and their options for studying abroad.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. Republicans in the US House of Representatives have joined Democrats to reject President Trump's veto of a defense bill. The Senate will vote on the measure on Tuesday and could, with a two-thirds majority, override for the first time Mr. Trump's use of the veto in the final weeks of his presidency. Earlier, the US President-elect Joe Biden said his transition team had faced what he called irresponsible obstruction from the political leadership of the Department of Defense, an allegation rejected by the acting Defense Secretary, Christopher Miller. The Bangladeshi Navy says an operation has begun to ferry a further 1,800 Rohingyas to a low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal. They'd been living in camps in the south of the country since fleeing ethnic violence in Myanmar. The British Ministry of Defence says 1,500 military personnel will be deployed to support the implementation of coronavirus testing in English schools and colleges before the new term starts in January. The media watchdog Reporters Without Borders says that 50 journalists were killed in connection with their work in 2020. Most were murdered in countries not at war. Journalists are increasingly targeted over investigations into corruption, organised crime or environmental issues. Prosecutors in New York City are investigating a confrontation between a black man, Keon Harold, a prominent jazz trumpeter, and a white woman who falsely accused his teenage son of stealing her phone in a hotel lobby. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio tweeted that the incident was racism plain and simple. Prince Charles has told the BBC he now sees the private sector as a critical part of the solution to climate change and what he called the real emergency the world now faced. Prince Charles said people thought he was completely dotty when he first raised environmental issues, but times had changed. BBC News.
Thank you for the latest news update. Hello, welcome. You are listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service. Claire and Lawrence with you. Thank you for joining us. Coming up, a refugee camp for Syrians is burnt to the ground in Lebanon, but then locals step in to house them. We're going to bring you that heartwarming story in just a few moments' time. And post-Brexit, the UK has finally got a trade and security deal signed off with the European Union. But there was a promise from the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, that the international student exchange programme called Erasmus would stay in place. It is not in this deal. So what does it mean for UK students hoping to study in Europe and students from Europe hoping to study in the UK? We'll have the lowdown on that too, all coming up here on Newsday. Stay with us.
Talk about events in Sudan, and the government is preparing to deploy what it calls a large number of troops to the state of South Darfur. There have been tribal clashes reported. A dozen of people at least have died, and the unrest is believed to have been between tribal groups contesting access to water. Now, the area, of course, is part of the troubled Darfur region in the west of Sudan. notorious for the bitter conflict that erupted there in 2003. Back in October, you may remember, the transitional government in Sudan finalised a peace deal, bringing in most of the rebel groups from Darfur, but not the group that's been most active on the ground. What do we know about what's happened there? I've been speaking to Crisis Advocacy Director of Human Rights Watch, Akshaya Kumar.
What we're seeing in South Darfur in some ways is entirely predictable, but that doesn't make it any less heartbreaking. It's another round of violent clashes that has led to death. It's led to people being evacuated to hospital. And it's one of a pattern that we've seen even within the past couple of months. There were similar clashes in October and in July between the Masalit community and the Falata, which are two different communities in the area. And all of this fighting and violence is rooted in the fact that there's never really been a resolution to what happened in Darfur. Darfur took the headlines about a decade ago for the ethnic cleansing that took place there, but there's never been justice and there's never been reconciliation. And unfortunately, many of the perpetrators are still around. And in fact, wearing the uniforms now of the government. And so the same guys who the government are going to be sending in to try to stabilize the situation potentially may be the very ones who've carried out atrocities in the past.
Well, this is why I wanted to ask you about the news, particularly in state media in Sudan, that large numbers of troops are being deployed. Of course, it was government state security forces who were crucial, to put it mildly, in the crisis in the past decade. So how is the presence of large numbers of state security forces going to help this problem area at all?
Well, it's quite worrying for two reasons. One, as you said, in some cases, these are the very perpetrators of crimes in the past, men who've never been held accountable for their acts. And now they're coming in wearing a different uniform, perhaps with a different hat on their heads, but still with the same histories and reputations. And the community doesn't trust them, and for good reason. And this community has made very clear, including to local and national government, that they don't want these forces. They've asked for different types of forces, people who might be seen as neutral, people who might come from other parts of the country to provide security. And they haven't received that support. And the other element of this, and this is really important, is the UN peacekeepers used to be located in this exact area of Darfur. In fact, in the town of Jaraida, where we've seen clashes now more than 3 times this year, there was a contingent of about 800 UN peacekeepers. But they left in 2018. And more peacekeepers left in 2019 from the regional capital. And now at the end of this year, we expect all UN peacekeepers to leave the Darfur region. And so what we're seeing in Jaraida, I worry, is a microcosm of what we might see in other parts of Darfur in the coming days.
But people will remember, won't they, the peace deal that was agreed with most armed groups in October. Is this upsurge of violence about something that wasn't dealt with in the peace deal, or is it actually much more on the ground, fight over resources, access to water, that kind of thing?
Yeah, the specifics of this particular community, I think, are much more about these unaddressed tensions. But in a way, you can think about it as a long festering issue, because people who were displaced because of fighting and violence over the past decade ended up in places like Jaraida, where they were living in a camp for internally displaced people, basically refugees inside their own country. And with the UN leaving, there's been a great deal of pressure on them to leave these camps and go back to whatever village they used to call home. Some of these villages were burned to the ground and others were reoccupied. And in the case of this town, a lot of the fighting that we've seen over the past couple of months has been actually between people who tried to go back. They were sort of new returnees who used to be displaced, and then they were trying to go back to wherever they came from, and other communities that didn't want these people back on this land. So it's all part of the bigger issue, which is that unfortunately there's been no reconciliation and there's been no justice delivered for these victims, people who lost their homes, who lost their family members, and who now seem to be losing the chance to live in peace or even go back to the place that they used to consider their home.
That's Akshay Kumar of Human Rights Watch.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Let's tell you this story now. Hundreds of Syrian refugees were forced to flee their makeshift camp in northern Lebanon after their tents were burnt down at the weekend. It's left more than 400 people homeless. Tensions have been rising between refugees and residents in recent years, and aid officials say that fighting broke out between local youths and the Syrian refugees. But there is a positive side to this story as well, as we're about to hear, because local Lebanese families have been offering the refugees space in their homes. Let's get more from Khaled Kabara, spokesperson for the UN Refugee Agency in northern Lebanon. Welcome to the programme. Let's just start off with the fire. There's been tension between refugees and the locals. Is that what started it?
Good morning, Claire, and thank you for having us. Indeed, there was a personal dispute, basically, between some Lebanese and Syrian refugees that quickly escalated into a fire in one of the informal settlements in Minya in northern Lebanon, which have resulted in a fire that burned the whole settlement to the ground, displacing around 400 individuals. We're talking about 90 refugee families losing their homes for the second time.
What you say informal, so this isn't a formal camp. Why is that? I mean, 400 is a lot of people.
So in Lebanon, there are no formal camps with a no encampment policy. So we have what we call as informal settlements. These are similar to camps in terms of structure. However, these are built by refugees themselves on private lands. In Lebanon, with the no encampment policies, refugees live in cities, in villages, in makeshift settings and structures, in temporary structures as well.
And that sounds like life is going to be pretty hard for them in these conditions. You help them build these camps?
What we do is we provide them with the needed material in order for them to enhance these structures, be it to withstand extreme weather conditions and to keep them safe and warm. In addition, we intervene in those sites by ensuring proper leveling, access to water, access to sanitation facilities, some sort of interventions that would ensure a dignified living condition for these refugees.
But presumably, if this camp in particular was made of wood and plastic sheeting, it's one of the reasons it burnt to the ground so quickly.
Quite unfortunately true, yes.
The upside to this, if there can be, these people are obviously in a perilous situation to begin with, is that once they lost everything, local families stepped in. Tell us more.
Yes, it's quite remarkable, honestly, on the evening, on the 26th of December, where as the fire was happening, we have seen a remarkable level of solidarity from the host community, as well as the relief agencies and authorities here in Lebanon. The host community were offering their vacant houses, vacant shelters, and sometimes vacant schools and hotels to host these families who were displaced and in that evening. We know that this is the winter, and winter is pretty harsh here, and the temperatures can drop down to zero. And we actually count on the acts of solidarity of the host community for Syrian refugees, because they're not only bearing the consequences of displacement, but they're also bearing with an additional layer this year, which is the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences on their challenges in general. So many refugees were hosted by neighbors, Lebanese neighbors in nearby areas, also by extended family members. So no one was left outside that evening.
Good to hear. Khaled, thank you for joining us. Khaled Kabara there, spokesperson for the UN Refugee Agency in northern Lebanon.
Now let's talk about another angle on Brexit. There is a well-established international student study exchange programme across European universities within the EU called the Erasmus programme. Now Brexit is removing those opportunities for British students. A replacement has been announced, but there's not a lot of details as yet. What does this mean for students? Let's speak now to Paul James Cardwell, who's Professor of Law at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, who's been looking into this in detail. Prof, welcome to the programme. Prime Minister Johnson says the cost to the government has been millions every year. Is that right? Was it more used by continental students than Brits?
Well, good morning. The Erasmus programme, as you quite rightly say, is focused and has traditionally been focused on university students being exchanged between European universities. It was established in 1987, and so over this 30-year period, it has evolved to include lots more things as well, including vocational training placements, school exchanges, and so on. So the budget covers all of that, plus staff exchanges and so on as well. So if you look at the bare figures, it looks like quite a big thing. And also, UK students have traditionally been regarded as being less involved than European students coming to the UK. That has changed over time. The number of students from the UK going out has increased, and also much more varied in terms of subject area beyond languages and so on. So although it is quite a large amount of money, this is indeed what it costs in order to support the students and everybody else participating in the programme.
And I wonder if it's going to be any cheaper with this replacement. It named the Turing scheme after the famous computer pioneer. But what are the challenges in getting a replacement for Erasmus off the ground? Because, I mean, it strikes me this is inevitably...
...is, of course, that there are any number of administrative obstacles. Contracts have to be agreed, which can take a very, very long time. And also the key aspect of these exchanges is that usually, in order to work, they work on a fee waiver basis. So some of the words coming out of the government at the moment are about students going to, for example, top-level US universities. Well, it's very difficult to imagine how they will let in exchange students without the tuition fee. And the budget allocated to the new Turing scheme, I can't see is going to be able to cover tuition fees as well as living expenses for students.
Also, you sort of need an umbrella, don't you, under which all this could happen, and that's what Erasmus used to do. It becomes, it seems to me, much more one-on-one and transactional, kind of like on a one-off basis if you're going to move towards the Turing model.
Exactly. So the Erasmus scheme, because it's evolved over such a long period of time, it means that European universities all have agreement and on a common framework about things like credits. So when you send a student, you know what the expectation of how many credits they should be doing, how you treat that coming back, the funding mechanisms, and the contracts work on basic standard terms. Once you start doing it bilaterally, and not even on a country basis, but just on an institutional level, then of course it's possible, but it takes a huge amount of resource and time and effort.
Who's going to lose out most, briefly?
Well, my fear is that it will actually be the students who are less financially well off in the UK who've been able to take advantages of the Erasmus programme, because it's not, the grants allowed onto it to individual students are not means tested. And although the stereotype is that it is better off middle class students, actually this has changed.
Lawrence and Claire with you, and James Gregg with the sport.
Thank you very much indeed, Lawrence. Not ideal this at all. Manchester City's match at Everton was postponed just 4 hours before kick-off because of an outbreak of coronavirus at the club. Everton said that they would request full disclosure of the information City provided to the Premier League that led to that decision. They are actually fine with the decision, Everton. Arsenal's Brazilian defender Gabriel also tested positive as well yesterday. Massive headache for the Premier League this. There's a really busy schedule coming up. We could get more from the BBC's Simon Stone.
It's something they absolutely will not want to do. It's something I'm sure they are crossing their fingers that they don't even have to discuss it. But I think it's there at the back of their minds, and if the pandemic gets worse, as we understand it is going to do in this country, then you wonder over the next few weeks and months just what the future holds for top-flight professional football in England.
Yeah, lots of talk about pausing the season already. In a game that did take place last night, Crystal Palace, as Ivory Coast striker Wilfred Zaha scored the opening goal at Selhurst Park, but Leicester City hit back with an equaliser from Harvey Barnes on 83 minutes in the 1-1 draw. Leicester are second in the table. They are 3 points behind leaders Liverpool. Chelsea and Aston Villa drew 1-1 at Stamford Bridge. Villa are 5th, Chelsea are 6th, split only by goal difference. Let's hear from the two managers then. In a moment, Dean Smith, but first, the thoughts of Frank Lampard.
Results are A1 importance, you know.
Plays tonight in the Premier League. Elsewhere, speaking to a Spanish TV channel, Lionel Messi said that he'd like to play in the United States and experience life and the league there, but ultimately go back to Barcelona in some capacity. Spanish football expert Guillem Balaguer told me he feels Messi will make the move one day.
I think the idea of actually going to the States is something that was put in his head by Antonella, who I think says Fabregas is thinking of going to the States, and Daniela, his wife, also thinks that that's a good possibility. So LA, Miami, New York, it will be something that they will consider. But I have to say, and he insisted on that, at some point in the future.
We'll be hearing what Neymar has been up to in the next hour, and more sport from me then as well here on Newsday.
James, thanks very much indeed. Big party. Neymar has had a massive party, and lots of people unhappy about that because, of course, coronavirus rampaging in Brazil amongst other countries as well. So that's the story he's talking about there. More on that in the next hour. Let's turn now to reactions to a sentence handed down to one of Saudi Arabia's best-known women's rights activists, Loujain Al-Hathloul, the prominent activist who campaigned for women's rights to drive, has been sentenced to more than 5 years in prison by a special criminal court set up to actually try terrorism charges. Ms. Al-Hathloul was arrested in May 2018, just before women were actually given the right to drive. Now, Saudi authorities deny her arrest had anything to do with that issue, but actually it was to do with, they say, trying to harm national security and advance a foreign agenda. Let's speak to Hibab Zayedin from Human Rights Watch, who's been following her case. So let's look at that first, that allegation, because this is the reason she's been given such a long sentence, that they allege she has harmed national security. What evidence do they have for that charge?
Really, the only thing that they've based the charge on is her confession, and Loujain has come forth with torture allegations. If you look at the charge sheet, and it is available online for anyone to look through, it is solely related to her peaceful human rights activism. They've cited her talking to foreign journalists, to diplomats, to human rights groups, applying to a UN job, submitting a shadow report to a UN commission. These are the things that she has been accused of, and that she has been now sentenced on terrorism charges for. Loujain's conviction is really proof that Saudi authorities view women's rights activism as a form of terrorism.
And if she wanted some kind of early release, because she's already been held in jail, obviously, for since 2018.
Illegal activity, and you can see that by illegal activity, it could just be as simple as talking to a diplomat. She could be returned to jail. So this kind of what the Saudi authorities see as saving face is by no means good news for Loujain or for Saudi Arabia's women's rights movement.
So for early release, she would have to promise her silence on these kinds of issues, or she's back in jail.
Absolutely, and other women's rights activists have been silenced this way as well. They have trials hanging over their head and have not been heard from since their release, even though these have been, again, other prominent women's rights activists who have really been the ones to pioneer, to bring to the international attention the struggles that Saudi women face.
Okay, well, listen, time is against us. We will have to leave it there. But thank you so much for the update. Hiba Zayedin there talking to us from Human Rights Watch.
6 minutes to the hour. Now, the US pulled itself out of the UN's World Health Organization earlier this year, accusing the body of being too close to China. But if you go back in history, you'll find that China has had its own problems with the WHO in the past. This, of course, as it's about to welcome WHO experts.
In the bloody battles of the Vietnam War more than 50 years ago, there was a common enemy causing devastation among troops on all sides, the malaria-carrying mosquito. Such was his concern that the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh sought help from his communist allies in China. And so began a secret medical research programme to find a cure for malaria. It was dubbed Project 523.
Back then, everything was so secretive. Only government-approved scientists could do this research, and we were banned from speaking about any of it to anyone.
Professor Lang Ling Fu was among the 500 Chinese scientists assigned to the project, which was launched by Chairman Mao on the 23rd day of the 5th month of 1967, hence Project 523. Professor Sir Nicholas White is a malaria expert from Oxford University's Centre for Tropical Medicine and Global Health.
So they were pragmatic. They just took anything that had been said to have worked in malaria or might work in malaria and testing it. And one of the things that had been recommended for malaria was the extract of a plant that we would call in the West Artemisia annua, and they called it Jinghao.
There wasn't a problem. On the contrary, their results were amazing. But it would be several more years before Professor Lang Ling Fu and his colleagues got fuller results from testing on humans and were able to say that their cure was effective.
The first communication to, if you like, the outside world, or at least the first generally disseminated communication, was until 1979, and then it was in a very delightfully brief paper of, I think, 5 or 6 pages.
That research paper was published not in Mandarin, but in English, says Professor White.
The fact that it was written in English, I think, clearly indicates that China had realised it had got something quite remarkable and felt confident to inform the rest of the world. Not that the rest of the world were particularly believing.
The distrust between China and the West was mutual. But in 1981, Professor White, by then working in neighbouring Thailand, travelled to China, where he met the Project 523 scientists.
I don't know what the official position was, but one of the leading doctors was Professor Li Jiaokuo, and he was very open, and he gave me some of the drugs. He said, happy to try and provide them to you. So I didn't get a sense that they were withholding anything.
But the WHO and the West remained sceptical for many more years.
I think we wasted probably 10 to 15 years, which was unnecessary, and Chinese drugs at that time, and then helped them to make them to the quality and purity that we require for general use. We would have saved a lot of lives.
A fascinating report from the historical background of the development of that anti-malaria drug and the WHO's and the world's attitudes to it from Mike Lanchin. This is Newsday with Lawrence and Claire. Got the news up. Then more from Newsday on the other side. Stay tuned. BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service. And here's what World Book Club have been reading.
I'm Harriet Gilbert, and we've been reading a novel published 7 years ago, a story of love and cinema set during the 1918 flu pandemic.
It was one of those rare moments in history where everything seems to happen at the same time.
The book's called Moonstone, The Boy Who Never Was, by the Icelandic author Sjón.
World Book Club, Sunday at 14 GMT. And in 60 minutes, people fixing the world.
Where this week, we catch up with some of our problem solvers from past programmes. Lewis, whose hydrating suites for the elderly are now on sale, and Marlene the pharmacist, who has restarted making cheaper drugs for her patients.
That's in an hour. Now we return to Newsday here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, welcome.
security forces to
something that came up during the impeachment inquiry. So he's really not the ideal candidate, I think, for the Biden transition.
I mean, as you say, Biden's whole idea was heal the wounds, don't actually point the finger. He's been driven to do this. Is this a sign of a political shift? Because in the background, we're also seeing, aren't we, a Trump veto of a defense bill, a spending bill, overridden. And in order for that to be overridden by Congress, it needs Republicans in Senate to vote against him, which they haven't done. So why did that happen?
It's another really interesting point. So today there was the first congressional override of his presidency. It was really significant as well, 322 votes to 87. Trump had telegraphed that he would veto this national defense authorization bill in advance. And so congressional leaders had moved to stop it. It's a really significant bill that increases pay for military members, among other things. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was a presidential candidate, also included a provision to rename bases named after Confederate officials in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer. So I think a lot of House Republicans decided that this bill was too important and too consequential to not object to the veto, especially with a lame duck president who's not going to be in office in 23 days' time.
But he's playing golf. That's Hugo Lowell, national political reporter and contributor at Politico.
Newsday BBC World Service. Health officials in South Korea say they are struggling to contain a third wave of the COVID-19 virus after recording the country's highest daily death toll since the pandemic began. South Korea has so far avoided a lockdown. Let's hear more about this now. I caught up earlier with our correspondent in Seoul, Laura Bicker.
Well, within the last 24 hours, 40 people have died from coronavirus. That's the highest death toll that this country has recorded since the pandemic began and since their first case was announced on January the 20th this year. Another 1,046 COVID-19 cases were recorded. And I know if you're sitting, especially in the likes of Europe, the UK, the United States, you're sitting thinking that South Korea is still doing well. They are still doing well. But 1,000 cases a day is really causing hospitals to fill up. Right now, critical beds are struggling. They're struggling to find critical beds for patients. Doctors are warning that they're facing a crisis. And the Prime Minister is telling people that this country is at a crossroads when it comes to COVID-19. Early on in this pandemic, South Korea was seen as a global model to follow. They were very quick to get a test in action, very quick to produce elite contact tracers, virus hunters, and that still continues. But it doesn't seem to be enough to stem the flow of this rising infection. I think part of the problem is the government is coming under increasing pressure to raise social distancing measures. And right now they've said that in the Greater Seoul area, only a maximum of 4 people can gather. But restaurants and coffee shops, etc., all remain open.
So do we know what is behind this latest spike then? As you say, it was such a success story early on. What's changed?
Well, it seems that a number of experts that I've spoken to blame a little bit of overconfidence. Way back, just October, November, as cases started to rise, I think most people said, look, they'll get it under control, as officials have managed to over most of the year. Even myself, I can remember saying to a colleague, oh, no, don't worry, they'll get it under control, because they are so good at contact tracing, because the testing is so easily available. However, cluster infections in prisons, in nursing homes have meant that older people have become infected, which has driven up the number of critically ill patients in hospital. Young people, especially in their 30s and 40s, are going home with the virus after being at work and spreading it to other family members. In fact, they're saying that a quarter of all infections have actually due to family gatherings. Now, the government, as I said, is trying to reduce that number by saying, look, only 4 people can gather at a time. But that is difficult to police. I think there's certain concern. There's still more discussions about where they go with social distancing measures and how far these infections rise. There is some kind of discussion that it may be at its peak right now, but we'll have to see in the coming days whether or not these daily case numbers begin to decline.
Our correspondent in Seoul, Laura Bicker, with that update.
And speaking of the repercussions of the new variant, particularly of the virus, the Spanish Health Ministry has made a very interesting step. They say they're going to set up a registry of people who refuse to be vaccinated against coronavirus. And they're then going to share that registry of anti-vaxxers with other European Union nations. The Health Minister, Salvador Illa, said vaccinations won't be mandatory, and the list of those who refuse to be inoculated won't be made public. Now, so far, polls seem to show about a third of all Spaniards saying they won't take the vaccine, although obviously that may change. Let's speak about this now with a former MP and a member of the Spanish Judiciary Council, Alphonse López Tena. Very warm welcome to the programme, Alphonse, once again. Do you think this is a good idea? What do you think about it in principle?
Good morning, and thanks for calling me. Well, that's the usual thing that is always done. I mean, every year there is a wide campaign of vaccination of flu, and there is a register of the people that take the flu vaccine because it's necessary to do afterwards what happens if it works, etc. When you go to some countries, it's mandatory to get a vaccine, like yellow fever, for instance. You have a register of the people that are being vaccinated, and those that haven't, because they are not allowed to go into that country.
That's quite interesting, because what you're raising there is the argument, I suppose, that this is merely just a reversal, or a kind of like the negative version, the black and white version of what people normally had. So if you need yellow fever, you have to prove that you've had the yellow fever vaccination. But in this case, what they're doing is they're proving that somebody hasn't had the coronavirus. So you're saying the principle is not that different.
No, because there is a big difference in this case. The big difference is because it is publicly offered to all the population. Vaccines in the case of flu or the yellow fever or any other vaccine is not offered publicly to all the population.
Right, that's true as well.
It's not a public pandemic.
But what's interesting is as I understand it, the Spanish government are not making the vaccination mandatory. So therefore, why potentially punish people for not doing something that isn't against the law?
Because if you do a list, you have a list of all the population, because all the population is publicly called to get the vaccine. So if you have a list of all the population, because they are called that day, that place, you have to go with that preparation, all these kind of things. I mean, it's not an easy thing. It's not just to go there and get vaccinated. We are talking about tens of millions of people. So when you have this list, you call somebody and that body doesn't present, you have in that list that person has gotten the vaccine that day, that hour, and that other arm presents after that a reaction, has problems, has fever, or nothing at all, as the immense majority of people, or this other person has not presented here. So we haven't vaccinated him or her.
But practically speaking,
the problem is if you have a list that everybody is called to be vaccinated, you will have a list of people who have and people who haven't.
But it would seem if you share that list with other European nations, you can't just wash your hands of what the consequences will be, because they're very likely to try to ban travel on people who haven't vaccinated and therefore aren't, it's thought, virus safe. So isn't the government actually making some of sort of imposing a negative and a problematic sort of imposition on some of its people?
Yeah, but you may think that to share it with other European countries or inside the World Health Organization, maybe in the future, is a decision of all these countries if they accept or they establish a system or not to have this information.
But still, it's very interesting as a kind of like a legal principle. Thank you so much for talking with us about it. Alphonse López Tena, former MP, member of the Spanish Judiciary Council, reflecting on that decision by the Health Ministry in Spain to set up a registry of people who refuse to be vaccinated against coronavirus and share it with other countries.
Newsday BBC World Service. Let's get your sports headlines now. Here's James.
COVID outbreaks causing real problems in the Premier League. It's a really busy time. Manchester City's Premier League match at Everton last night was postponed 4 hours before kick-off. Well, there's so many fixtures to get into the schedule at the moment. Just not quite sure when they're going to get those matches played. Talk of pausing the season. Chelsea, meanwhile, that match did go ahead. They did drop points, though, against Aston Villa. They're in 6th place. They drew 1-1. There's 5 matches taking place later in the Premier League as well. Legendary striker Lionel Messi has once again hinted that he could leave Barcelona in June. I spoke to a Spanish football expert a little earlier. He reckons that Messi's off when his contract runs out in Spain later on next year. And Brazil star Neymar apparently hosting a party. 150 people. Not meant to be doing that at the moment. I spoke to our man in Rio about it. Hear that in 30 minutes' time here on the programme.
Yeah, they're calling it Neymar Palooza. Sounds like quite a party, but obviously not without controversy right now. For now, James, thanks very much indeed. We look forward to that. Let's talk to Andrew Wood now on the BBC Business Desk in Hong Kong. Andrew, European Union negotiators, of course, very busy at the moment. Last week, they finally signed off this agreement with the UK for a trade and security deal after the Brexit transition period, signing that off on Christmas Eve. Now, reports say the EU and China are about to announce a deal for business investment. So what can we expect there?
Well, this is actually talks on this have been going on for a long time. They started talking about it in 2014. What we're expecting here is basically it will make it easier for Chinese companies to invest in the European Union and vice versa. In particular, European Union companies are quite excited by the possibility of getting into manufacturing in China, advertising, air transport, telecoms, and so on. The reciprocal thing is, Chinese companies will be able to invest in the European Union more. There has been an awful lot of sensitivity, though, about national security. Beijing's expected, so the reports say, will be able to invest in a small part of renewable energy in the European Union, and that's, basically the Chinese will grant similar access to the Europeans, but national security issues perhaps will restrict that.
So, closer moving together, one could say, between the EU and China, whereas America, under the current Trump administration, has very definitely been going in the other direction. I guess the question is, will that change when President-elect Joe Biden is in office?
Well, I think the Chinese, it probably to their advantage to try to show a victory or show an achievement in improving the business relationship between China and a big chunk of the world economy, the European Union. And it perhaps separates the European Union and the Americans over this as well, because the Americans seem to be an awful lot more sceptical, wary of what China is doing as far as national security is concerned. The Europeans have, to a certain extent, followed the American example over Huawei, the Chinese telecom communications company. A lot of countries have followed the American lead there. But this, this is going to split the two, perhaps here, two important parts of the West over their relationship with China.
Andrew, as ever, thank you for the update. Andrew Wood on our business desk in Hong Kong.
Now, we're going to talk about Handel's Messiah, glorious musical milestone, originally first performed in 1741. It's a choral celebration of Christ's story, which makes it, of course, a seasonal favourite at this moment. Now, it's frequently been adapted and reworked by musicians to reflect changing times, usually in terms of its presentation, but a Canadian opera company has interpreted it online and is making it available online as well in a pandemic-friendly sort of way, as a way of celebrating diversity. So the performers in what's called Messiah Complex are Asian, Arab, indigenous people. They are fantastic singers. They often translate the lyrics and sing in their own languages. I've been speaking to the director behind it, Renelta Arluk, who is an Inuit from the Northwestern Territories in Canada and helps run the company against the grain behind Messiah Complex.
because Handel isn't Canadian, right? It came from Europe to Canada and then was taken and brought into the churches. And so if you look at how we can bring Handel into our communities, our isolated communities, our northern communities, our indigenous communities, then they have to have a different outlook. And so looking at it from the place of spirit, of connection, of rejoicing, then it takes it out of the church and takes it out of Europe and puts it into the community. And when you bring that into Indigenous language, then oh my goodness, then you're actually connecting to your community and celebrating your community. And that's where that interpretation or that claiming is so important.
And how do the different languages work? How do they sound? I mean, because many indigenous languages don't, they don't use words in the same way. They don't use breath in the same way as European languages, as English. So what do you gain by using indigenous languages? How different does it sound in the translation?
Oh, it's so beautiful. You should really listen to it. So with specifically with Inuktitut and Southern Shoshone, the language is tonal. And so in a lot of the indigenous languages, there's a tonal quality to it. So one of the negotiations is how do you honor and recognize the music, and how do you honor and recognize the language and align that? And I think that that's where that beautiful connection and navigation was really vital and fun. I think the soloists that sang in the indigenous language loved it because they got to navigate the music and the language.
هو المسيح الذي مات بل
Is it, in a kind of like a weird way, actually an advantage to have it available online? Because I suspect maybe that might be easier for your target audience to access than if it had taken place in a kind of like a standard, an arts concert place.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There are two great advantages that came from doing this, which was that Handel has become even more accessible into the isolated communities that a lot of these soloists reside in. I was raised in a community of 1,100 in the Arctic, and we didn't have Handel's Messiah in our community, and so being able to form a relationship with this music from such a deep community engaged way through language and place, it has actually been quite inspiring. Now you can watch it, and anyone around the world can watch it and see how important our relationship to community and land and water is, and how celebrated that is. And in this beautiful celebrated music that has become so connected to the season.
So there you are, performance by the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Amongst the singers, Arabic, English, French, Inuktitut and Tutchone as well, indigenous languages in Canada, with some of the singers translating and singing in their own indigenous languages. It's called Messiah Complex, Against the Grain Theatre Company in Toronto. And all you have to do, if you're interested in listening to it complete and seeing it as well, there's films attached to it as well, then all you have to do is register, and you can hear the Toronto Symphony Orchestra and singers performing Handel's Messiah as never performed before.
This is the BBC World Service. the host of an annual series of talks from the most prominent and influential thinkers from across the world.
We present the Reith Lectures, an annual series of broadcasts.
The factors involved are as much economic as social.
Looking at economic systems and choices.
What is the biggest problem facing the world economy today?
We live in a time of financial crisis.
There will be a fundamental shift of economic power.
Economies, financial markets, they've long been a focal point of the Reith Lectures. How do they work, and how have they come to shape our society as a whole?
We value things in markets. How should we look at the value of life?
Dr. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, charts how these economic principles have seeped into the way in which we think.
How do we channel the market in service of society?
And how this impacts the way we live.
The Reith Lectures at bbcworldservice.com.
Hello, welcome to Newsday from the BBC World Service. Lawrence Pollard and Claire MacDonald with you.
This half-hour we'll hear how a new variant of the COVID-19 virus is driving the steep rise in infection in South Africa, which has now gone into a new lockdown.
We'll hear the sister of the Saudi campaigner for women's right to drive.
And did Neymar really lay on a 5-day party in the middle of a pandemic? We'll be finding out. Stay with us.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. Republicans in the US House of Representatives have joined Democrats to reject President Trump's veto of a defense bill. The Senate will vote on the measure on Tuesday and could, with a two-thirds majority, override for the first time Mr. Trump's use of the veto in the final weeks of his presidency. Earlier, the president-elect Joe Biden described as irresponsible the obstruction his transition team had faced from the political leadership of the Department of Defense. The Bangladeshi Navy says an operation has begun to ferry a further 1,800 Rohingyas to a low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal. They'd been living in camps in the south of the country since fleeing ethnic violence in Myanmar. The British Ministry of Defence says 1,500 military personnel will be deployed to support the implementation of coronavirus testing in English schools and colleges. 6 people who travelled to India from the UK have tested positive for the new variant of coronavirus first identified in Britain. The Indian government says they're now in isolation. The media watchdog Reporters Without Borders says that 50 journalists were killed in connection with their work in 2020. Most were in countries not at war. Journalists are increasingly targeted over investigations into corruption, organised crime or environmental issues. Prince Charles has told the BBC he now sees the private sector as a critical part of the solution to climate change and what he called the real emergency the world now faced. Prince Charles said people once thought he was completely dotty when he raised environmental issues, but times had changed. Tributes have been paid to the renowned Mexican singer-songwriter Armando Manzanero, who died on Monday at the age of 85. The Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador hailed him as a great composer. BBC News.
Thank you for the latest news update. Hello, welcome. You're listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service. Lawrence Pollard and Claire MacDonald with you. Thank you for joining us. We'll start in South Africa in just a moment. We'll also go live to hear from the Red Cross in Mozambique. Another cyclone on the way there, sadly. We'll bring you an interview about Brazilian football star Neymar, who's said to be, well, he's said to have had a 5-day Christmas into New Year party as Brazil battles COVID. Lots of people apparently had to give up their phones at the door, so there wasn't any record of it. We'll be finding out the validity of all of that, and we'll hear from a remarkable 11-year-old boy here in the UK who's raised over $130,000 for a hospice. How has he done it? Well, he'll tell us in 20 minutes.
Let's begin in South Africa, though. Tighter restrictions brought in because of that new contagious South African variant of the coronavirus, which seems to be driving a sharp rise in infections. President Ramaphosa made an emotional speech in which he said the rapid rise pointed to an extreme lack of vigilance over the festive period. He said all bars, restaurants and shops are going to close. That ban on the sale of alcohol is going to return, and fines for not wearing a mask. He was warning that if South Africans don't observe the measures, it's going to be a disaster for everyone.
We are at an extremely dangerous point in our fight against the pandemic. Unless we act now, and unless we act decisively, and thousands more people will lose their lives. The stark reality is that every single district in this country has the potential to become a hotspot unless we observe the current preventative measures.
We've been discussing the new threat with Dr. Richard Lascelles, who's an infectious diseases specialist at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and who helped identify this South African variant of COVID-19.
A lot of the pressure was actually coming from frontline clinicians in the last week or so, because the health services, both public and private, have come under increasing strain. And just the rapid rise in cases over the past couple of weeks has really stretched services in many of the parts of the country.
And we heard the president there talking, particularly pointing out the effects of lack of vigilance, as he calls it, over the festive period. In terms of the new restrictions being brought in, can change of social habit be enough? What can, if everyone sticks to these new rules, what could be achieved?
Well, I think we hope that that will give us significant slowing of the transmission. I think one of the challenges has been, like everywhere, the kind of consistency and the coherence of the message. So for a long time, there's been trying to get individuals to take personal responsibility, but that's been in the context of pretty light restrictions. And I think after last night's address and these new restrictions, I don't think anyone can be in any doubt as to the seriousness of the situation and the need for us all to take personal responsibility and to do what we each can do to prevent the spread of the virus.
Are we seeing one of these situations where the new variant is basically responsible for all new infections? I mean, is it replacing the previously circulating variants? How dominant is it now?
Yeah, that is essentially what we're seeing. In the areas where there's a lot of transmission, we've seen it rapidly become the dominant variant or lineage circulating. So in parts of Eastern Cape and Western Cape, it's now essentially almost 100% of the samples that we are sequencing in our genomic sequencing. And in KwaZulu-Natal, it's about 2/3 of the sequences. So it is rapidly becoming the predominant circulating variant.
That's Dr. Richard Lascelles, one of those at the University of KwaZulu-Natal who first managed to identify this new South African variant of COVID.
Newsday, BBC World Service. Let's turn now to reactions to the sentence handed down to one of Saudi Arabia's best-known women's rights activists. She's Lujain al-Hathloul. The prominent activist who campaigned for women's rights to drive has been sentenced to more than 5 years in prison by a special criminal court, and that court was actually set up to try terrorism charges. Ms. al-Hathloul was arrested in May 2018, just before women were given the right to drive. Saudi authorities deny her arrest had anything to do with that issue. She was convicted of various charges, including trying to harm national security and advance a foreign agenda, all denied by her. Let's speak now to her sister, Alia al-Hathloul. Welcome to Newsday, Alia. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you and your family have fought continuously against this sentence, against her imprisonment. So 5 years and 8 months, what do you make of that?
Hi. So first of all, it's 5 years and 8 months. But if you do all the calculation, because she spent already 3 years, almost 3 years in prison, and there for 2 years and a half, she doesn't need to stay in prison. So it means that she can be freed by next March 2021. However, Lujain, she really was very, very sad when she heard the news and the sentence, because for her it means that the court consider her as terrorist, and that's why she's going on appeal. She will appeal so in order to obtain her innocence.
Okay, and what do they base that on, that charge on? What exactly are they saying that she's done to actually have this charge of terrorism levelled against her?
So if you read the charges, it is there are so many charges. For example, applying for the United Nations, tweeting on Twitter and using social media to advocate for women's rights. There are everything related to her activities, and also being in contact with international NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, etc. But also contacting, for example, the UK embassy and contacting the European Union representation in Saudi Arabia. And they consider those two entities, with also Netherlands, those three entities as terrorist or foreign entities. So it is a bit strange. They are allies, and at the same time, they are considered as terrorists.
Indeed, yes, that's an argument that has got many contradictions in it, hasn't it? And also, the court dismissed claims that she had been tortured whilst she was held. Now, you would dispute that?
Exactly. So it was the whole process and the acceleration of the trial started almost 2 weeks ago. And in 2 weeks ago, it was mainly about the charges against Lujain. And when the judge said, okay, by next session, I will pronounce the verdict. And Lujain said, okay, but you never investigate on the torture. How come? And they said, okay, we will start. And the next day, it was at the regular court at trial regarding the torture. And a few days after, they said, okay, we did the investigation and we conclude that there was no torture. So it was.
And you say, and she says, what exactly happened to her? What you're detailing is quite horrific.
It is extremely shocking. So it's impossible to imagine that such things could happen in prison. And especially, I mean, when we say Saudi Arabia, we know that the situation of women, but also the women, we try to overprotect them. So sometimes it is impossible to imagine that men they do all these bad things to a single woman in a cell. She was even sexually harassed, electrocuted, forced to eat till getting very sick. And she was shaking, difficulty to breathe, etc. for a couple of months.
And of course, she was incarcerated just shortly before her campaign to allow women, one of the things that allow women to be able to drive in Saudi Arabia, actually got the go-ahead. So she hasn't experienced that, but she can be released from jail. As you say, the release can be as early as the spring next year. But I guess if she wants to carry on campaigning, that would be a problem for her. She may end up back inside jail. So what has she communicated to you she intends to do? Who's she looking to help her?
Well, first of all, the main, you need to choose your battle at certain points. So the fight she's doing right now is to prove that she was tortured. So this is the first thing, and also to get her innocence. So I guess doing those fights, it is her priority for the time being. We will see it later on.
Okay, well, good to talk to you, and we will obviously be following that story very closely to find out what happens to Lujain Al Hathloul on her release. That's her sister, Alia Al Hathloul. Thank you for talking to Newsday.
Time for the sport. Here's James Gregg.
Well, Manchester City's match at Everton last night in the Premier League was called off because of COVID cases in the City camp. All of the club's players will be tested again today. That's to assess the extent of the outbreak. But the BBC's Simon Stone says their next two games are in serious doubt.
On Sunday, they are due to play at Chelsea in the Premier League. 4 days after that, they play Manchester United in the EFL Cup semi-final. There has to be a doubt as to whether those two matches will take place.
The There's never a good time for a COVID outbreak, but certainly not at the moment from a Premier League perspective. 5 matches taking place tonight as well. And in American football, Washington have released quarterback Dwayne Haskins after he breached coronavirus protocols. He was fined $40,000. He was removed as captain last week after he was being filmed at a party without a mask. Sticking with that COVID breaching theme too next. Yeah, we're going to stick with sport. Well, sort of. Brazil and PSG football star Neymar is at the centre of a new controversy after Brazilian media reported that he's organising a huge New Year's Eve party. Some even say a 5-day-long party. That's despite the coronavirus pandemic and a surge in infections and deaths in Brazil as well. So what's the truth? Well, I started off by asking our sporting correspondent in Brazil, Tim Vickery.
It appears that Neymar, over a few days, will be celebrating the New Year, with the main party obviously being on New Year's Eve. All of this in the small coastal town of Mangaratiba, just down the coast from Rio. Reports have said when this story first broke in the O Globo newspaper that there would be 500 guests. It now seems more likely that number may be 150 on the nights. There is a company that organise parties who said they are organising a party for 150. Now, Neymar's staff are denying that Neymar has anything to do with this. Neymar himself is keeping quiet about this subject. He hasn't referred to it on social media, and according to the Brazilian media, he is banning mobile phones from the party. He doesn't want photographs circulating. So if this goes ahead, if the main night goes ahead, certainly Neymar's staff recognise that this is a public relations disaster in a time of COVID. Brazil is rapidly approaching the mark of 200,000 deaths. Some ex-players and some from the Brazilian media are giving him some strong criticism. One ex-player who has a strong media profile is appealing with him not to go through with the party on New Year's Eve.
Yeah, look, second highest death toll in the world. Are people not angry at him for just having scant disregard for that fact? Or from your experience of living there for so long and speaking to folk, are people a little bit blinded by Neymar? Do they let him do what he wants, or is there that criticism there from the public?
Well, first, let's remember that at the moment we don't have facts. We have reports. We don't have facts. If this party does go ahead, if everything is confirmed, then huge swathes of Brazilian society will be very angry with him. Recently, in fact, very recently, some of the Brazilian media have gone out of their way to praise his growing maturity. In fact, probably one of the leading Brazilian journalists in Europe said, Neymar is gaining increasing praise for maturity, positioning himself on issues like racism and so on. Those kind of people are feeling very betrayed. In fact, one journalist has written a blog about how much of an idiot he feels for praising Neymar's maturity. So swathes of Brazilian society will think of Neymar, if this does go ahead as reported, as a COVID-idiot. However, we are dealing with a very divided society. President Bolsonaro has continually played down the risk of the coronavirus. He isn't wearing a mask. He's saying that he's not interested in taking the vaccine. He wants life to go ahead as much as possible. Brazilian football is being played behind closed doors. Bolsonaro says he doesn't agree with this, and him and his health ministry have already established that that 30% of stadium capacity should be filled by supporters. So Brazil is a very divided society on this issue. Many will criticise Neymar, some will support him, and I suspect on this issue, the position taken will not be so much down to whether they love Neymar or not. It will be on how they view the COVID situation and what their opinion is of President Bolsonaro.
Where does it leave him with PSG, Tim? Presumably they aren't going to be too happy about just needless controversy, whether the reports are true or not?
No, and it's really not going to reflect well on the club if one of their star assets does behave in an irresponsible manner. I wonder whether there will be repercussions from that end, because although this party, if it happens, will be taking place a long, long way away from Paris, he is an employee of Paris Saint-Germain, and what he does reflects on the image of the club.
It will, definitely, yeah. Tim Vickery there, based in Rio, talking about Neymar. More on our website, Everything Sports, as ever, bbc.com/sport, Lawrence.
Fascinating. James, thank you very much indeed. 10 minutes to the hour. Now we're going to talk about New Zealand's first MP from Africa, Ibrahim Omer, born in Eritrea. There's an amazing story about how he was forced to flee as a teenager and eventually ended up going viral as well with his what's called the maiden speech. He was elected to Parliament in New Zealand in November, and he's been speaking in Wellington to the BBC's Mauricio Olmedo Perez, and he began explaining about his journey from East Africa.
I will be on your side and fight alongside you. Norera, tena koto, tena koto, tena tato katoa.
A flood of tears and a standing ovation for an Eritrean Kiwi delivering his maiden speech in Parliament. Ibrahim Omer made it into government after Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party won a landslide election.
It's hard to put it into words.
I meet him in the debating chamber where he made his speech that went viral.
Earlier I was quite nervous because I didn't practice enough. I did not expect in my wild dreams to have an impact that it did. Someone like me, only 5 years ago I was a cleaner.
We'll come back to that cleaning soon. First, back to his roots in the Eritrean capital of Asmara, where he grew up in what he describes as a happy, traditional Muslim family.
I used to get in trouble all the time because I spent so much time playing soccer. But at the same time, I always loved reading.
He also had a love for languages, 6 in fact, including English, which he taught himself. And it was those language skills which would shape his future in ways he could never have imagined. In the 1990s, war broke out between Eritrea and its neighbour Ethiopia. Ibrahim was in his final year at high school and was conscripted, sent to the front line to train, and when he finished, he narrowly avoided combat as a truce was declared.
People who left the training camp 2-3 weeks earlier, where some of them died, my friends, some of them severely disabled.
But he was still in danger. With political instability and internal conflicts becoming violent, many in the army were deserting. He was threatened by a superior to give information on some of his comrades who'd escaped, but he refused.
And that's when I started thinking, okay, I don't have any future in this country.
Ibrahim made the huge decision to also desert, going into hiding for 8 months before being smuggled across the border to Sudan. Presenting himself to the Sudanese authorities, he entered a refugee camp where he got himself a life-changing break, working as a translator for the UN Refugee Agency. But when Sudan itself fell into conflict, his interpreting work saw him accused of being a spy, and he was arrested.
Interrogation, often they come in the night and intimidate me and tell us, who do you guys spy for?
He was detained for almost 6 months, until one day he pretended to be sick and was taken to a hospital where he managed to alert the UN of his whereabouts. Released on bail, he faced deportation back to Eritrea, so he sought refugee status in another country.
And that's when New Zealand was looking for some cases, and they came to interview people. The first thing given to them was my case, and got interviewed.
What did you know about New Zealand?
Nothing. I didn't know. I didn't know the country exists.
So, in 2008, Ibrahim was on a plane to the bottom of the world to live in New Zealand's capital, Wellington. He worked 2 full-time jobs, 80 hours a week, to save enough for fees. The night before he started uni, he was there well before any other student because he was cleaning the same theatre that he would later be sitting in for his first lecture as a political studies student.
Finished at 4 o'clock, slept for about 4 hours. 10 o'clock was my first lecture. Spent 20 minutes just lost in thought. I had a small notebook, all these young students with flash laptops, and quite intimidating, but to me it was just a dream that came true.
He began campaigning for the Labour Party as a volunteer and got involved with trade unions, fighting for the rights of cleaners and other low-paid professionals. Ibrahim's hard work was finally rewarded when he was listed as a candidate for Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party in the upcoming election.
And I consider the Labour Party to be deeply privileged and lucky to now have Ibrahim as a candidate for us.
And as you heard, he was speaking in Maori as well in that now famous speech that he made, his maiden speech. I stand before you as a Kiwi bursting with pride. No wonder that went down well with the House and with New Zealanders as well. That was Ibrahim Omer talking to the BBC's Mauricio Olmedo Perez in Wellington.
And here's another uplifting story for you to end the programme on today. Here in the UK, a boy of just 11 years old has raised more than $135,000 that's around 100,000 UK pounds, for a hospice for terminally ill patients. Now, he's done this by camping out in his back garden every night since the UK's first coronavirus lockdown in March. He's Max Woozy, and he was inspired by his elderly neighbour Rick, who gave him a tent shortly before he died in February. Rick's wife, Sue, also was cared for by the same hospice. Delighted to say Max joins us now. Morning, Max.
Hi.
Have you been outside last night? Did you sleep in the tent?
Yeah, I slept in the tent last night. Last night was my 280th night, actually.
Wow. Now, for people not in the UK, we've got snow here at the moment. It's pretty cold. How cold was it?
It was freezing, but unfortunately there's no snow.
Oh, okay. But listen, we admire your commitment to this, and what an incredible achievement. Tell us about the start of this, the inspiration for you, your neighbour Rick, who's sadly no longer with us.
So, my neighbour Rick, we all knew he was going to die because he had cancer. So he gave me a tent saying, Max, I want you to promise me to have an adventure in this tent. And I said, I will, I promise you that. And then after he died, I found out that the North London Hospice, what's the hospice I'm carrying, what I'm doing the money for, they had all their fundraising cut, like fun runs and all of that because of COVID. So I thought, what could I do? Sleep in a tent to raise money that could help the hospice and keep the adventure that Rick wanted me to do.
It's a perfect combination, isn't it, of two brilliant aims. So, I mean, what a total you've reached. You can't have ever imagined you'd reach such a sum of money. It's really snowballed, hasn't it?
Yeah, I was only ever setting out to do £100, then stop and go, raise £100. That's more than my friends have. But now that's just doubled, increasingly to £100,000. It's just it's out of this world.
It's mind-boggling. It's a mind-boggling figure, isn't it? And we had a storm in the UK a couple of days ago, Storm Bella. I'm guessing you weathered that one as well. How was it?
It was miserable. I was going out to go into my tent. You could barely see a thing. It was just raining, really windy, a bit foggy, and I was going out in my garden, and I slipped right before getting into my tent onto the muddy grass. My teddy, sleeping bags, jammies, everything was covered in mud.
But you carried on. Do your parents ever say to you, you know what, Max, it's brilliant what you've done, but maybe we should call it a day now?
Every night. They always try and persuade me to get back in the tent. No, in the house, sorry, and I say no.
And why do you say no?
I like it out there, and I know that it is hard at the moment because it's really cold and wet, but I know that it's going to a good deed. I know it's going to a good cause that's saving lives, and that's remarkable. So I kind of like feeling that. So.
And what do you think Rick would say, or what do you think he would think about what you're doing now?
I think he'd be outside in another tent with me doing this.
What a lovely thought. I'm sure he is. Listen, it's fantastic what you've done, Max. Long may you continue. We'll check in with you again to see whether you've gone back indoors. But thank you so much for talking to us here on Newsday, Max.
Thank you.
Max Woozy there, who has spent his 280th night outside raising over $100,000 for that hospice. What a boy. That was Newsday. Lawrence and Claire back tomorrow.
This is the BBC World Service, and we're asking, has COVID-19 changed our senses?
Sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch in the context of a pandemic.
Back in April, 4 radio producers across Europe, we started collecting stories and exchanging experiences.
As a blind person wearing the mask, it's like for me having a wall in front of me.
Revolution of the senses at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in half an hour, it's Business Daily.
We'll be asking how our eating habits have changed during a year when lockdowns have seen more of us cooking at home and fewer of us sharing meals out with colleagues. And can Zoom calls replace the networking coffee or dinner?
That's after People Fixing the World on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up after the news, it's People Fixing the World with me, Claire Bates. This week we're catching up with some of our innovators from past programmes. In 2018, Lewis was whipping up hydrating sweets for people with dementia in his student kitchen. He says they're now on sale.
It's been fantastic, we've produced over 1 million drops.
Then there's Marlene, the pharmacist, who had been told to stop making a cheaper version of a drug for patients with a rare disease. Marlene refused to give up and is back in production again, much to the relief of her patients.
It has given me a lot more peace of mind. It's going well now.
And remember that housing experiment where the residents were under 25s or pensioners and encouraged to socialise? We learn how they coped when the COVID pandemic hit.
It went very well. The youngsters, they helped the elderly in buying food and groceries.
That's People Fixing the World after the BBC News.
Hello, this is Danielle Jałowiecka with the BBC News. Republicans in the US House of Representatives have joined Democrats to reject President Trump's veto of a defense bill. The Senate will vote on the measure on Tuesday and could, with a 2/3 majority, override for the first time Mr. Trump's use of the veto in the final weeks of his presidency. Julian Bedford reports.
It's been a humiliating 24 hours for Mr. Trump. First under pressure from inside and outside his administration, he signed the coronavirus stimulus package. Then the House showed rare unity to override his veto of the sprawling defence bill. Mr. Trump had objected to, amongst other things, clauses stripping the names of Confederate generals from military bases. Attention now switches to the Senate, which on Tuesday could deliver the first reverse of a presidential veto of the Trump term.
Earlier, President-elect Joe Biden had said his team was not getting enough information regarding national security issues. The Bangladeshi Navy says an operation has begun to ferry a further 1,800 Rohingyas to a low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal. Rights groups say some of the refugees are being forced to move. The Bangladeshi authorities say they wanted to leave the overcrowded camps where they've lived since fleeing ethnic violence in Myanmar. The British Ministry of Defence says military personnel will be deployed to support the implementation of coronavirus testing in English schools and colleges. Britain has seen the rate of new infections increase rapidly, driven in part by a new, more infectious strain. With more details, here's Catherine Stanchishin.
A total of 1,500 armed forces personnel are being made available. They'll form local response teams, providing predominantly remote advice to schools, although some will be deployable in person if needed. The government has said a safe return to school for pupils and teachers amid rising coronavirus cases would be built on an effective testing system. But some teaching unions think schools simply haven't been given enough time to prepare.
6 people in India have tested positive for the new variant of coronavirus first identified in the UK earlier this month. All of them had travelled to the country from the UK. From Mumbai, Yogita Lamaye reports.
The government says that the 6 people infected by the new variant are in isolation in the southern cities of Bangalore and Hyderabad and in Pune in western India. Their close contacts are being screened. India is among dozens of countries that have suspended flights from the UK over concerns about the new strain. The government says 33,000 passengers who arrived from the country over the past month are being traced and tested. Meanwhile, quarantine rules for people coming in from other nations have been tightened at some airports in India.
World News from the BBC. The media watchdog Reporters Without Borders says that 50 journalists were killed in connection with their work in 2020. The annual report shows that while the number killed in war zones is declining, journalists are being increasingly targeted because of investigations into corruption, organised crime or environmental issues. Mexico, India and the Philippines are highlighted as places where such murders took place. Prosecutors in New York City have launched an investigation into a confrontation between a black man and a white woman who falsely accused his teenage son of stealing her phone. In a video posted online by Keon Harold, a prominent jazz trumpeter, the unidentified woman demands Mr. Harold's son return her phone. According to Mr. Harold, an Uber driver returned the phone to the woman shortly after the incident. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio called the incident racism, plain and simple. Prince Charles has told the BBC he now sees the private sector as a critical part of the solution to climate change. The heir to the British throne said that in the past 18 months there had been a change of approach among firms as they recognised what he called the real emergency the world now faced.
It's the private sector, which has in many ways contributed to the problem over the past century, is now in fact a necessary and critical part of the solution. And I haven't been wasting my time during this ghastly pandemic in having more and more video round tables and Zoom calls, and suddenly we're finding engagement on a scale I would never have believed.
Tributes have been paid to the renowned Mexican singer-songwriter Armando Manzanero, who died on Monday, aged 85. The Mexican president showed a video of the musician in performance and hailed him as a great composer. Famed for his romantic ballads, Manzanero was the first Mexican to receive a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Many of his lyrics were translated into English and recorded by international artists. BBC News.
People fixing the world.
Hello and welcome to People Fixing the World at the BBC World Service. Each week we bring you solution stories from around the globe. I'm Claire Bates. As usual at this time of year, we thought this would be a good time to catch up with some of the fabulous innovators from past programmes, to see how their ideas have developed and how they've coped in 2020. Coming up...
I went to work, I went home, and I played on my computer. It was lonely.
Fia, a young person from Sweden, was struggling with loneliness. She joined a housing experiment open only to young adults and pensioners, where residents agreed to socialise for at least 2 hours a week. She quickly made friends in the community, but just a few months later, the COVID pandemic hit.
We tried to be the bad guy, you can't socialize, please keep distance and things like that.
We look at how the project had to adapt and what that meant for the residents. Plus, we catch up with Marleen, a pharmacist from the Netherlands. She'd been making a drug herself for patients with a rare disease. That was after a pharma company massively increased its prices.
So it's really hand manufacturing. In one day we can do the preparation of CDCA for, I think, 5-6 patients.
Production had to be halted at the end of 2018 after an inspection found an impurity in her pills. But Marleen refused to give up. We'll catch up with her later in the programme to find out what happened next. But first, we're looking at a clever idea to help people living with dementia. There are 50 million cases of it worldwide, and this is set to almost triple by 2050, according to the World Health Organization. Back in December 2018, we met Lewis, whose grandma Pat had the condition. He was spurred into action after she was hospitalised due to dehydration. He discovered this was a common problem, as people with dementia often forget to drink. So the young design graduate decided to come up with a solution. Our reporter Cecilia Silva met Lewis at Pat's care home to check out the result. Water in the solid form of jelly sweets.
I got like a chocolate box out
And residents that were otherwise disengaged or would ignore me, you offer them a chocolate and they're like, oh yes, thank you, and take about 5. So I used that as the vehicle to get them to interact with this solid form of hydration.
The sweets themselves are actually surprisingly thick. I thought they may be a bit more fluid than that, almost as they're filled with water, but they're almost like the same state as solid jelly.
The drops themselves, they're sort of like an upside down teardrop shape, which means they're really well planted in the tray, but there's a big globule at the top, which means it's easy to pick up if you've got weak grips or limited dexterity.
So I'm just going to pick up a red one, and they do actually taste just like jelly and ice cream.
It seems to be a texture and like a flavour that they like to eat, and I think specifically with dementia they tend to like sweeter things, so that's why they're this sort of sweet taste.
How many sweets would a patient have to eat in order to maintain a healthy hydration level?
It's not designed to be, the sole source of hydration, although it could be. So a box is around half the recommended daily fluid intake, so 7 drops is equivalent to a glass. When I first gave them to my grandma, she ate 7 in the first 10 minutes. Obviously, they're going to be more expensive than a glass of tap water. If you're not drinking that tap water and you can't get them to engage with it, then it's going to have a knock-on effect.
The jelly sweets, which were 95% water, were a huge hit with Pat and other residents at her care home. But at that stage, Lewis was whipping them up in his student kitchen. I recently caught up with Lewis, and he has an exciting update.
We spent the next sort of 18 months raising investment, developing the product, working with confectionery experts, and really getting it from a prototype to a market-ready product, and then we launched in July 2020.
Lewis said his first break came when a woman contacted him out of the blue on social media. She was a member of the public who'd heard about his story and wanted to help. So she set up an online fundraising account, and this raised nearly £10,000. A few months later, the UK charity Alzheimer's Society invited his team onto a business accelerator programme, which helped them to shape and improve the product further.
I definitely want to be able to do this by myself. For the first year there were 3 of us, and then within the last year we were going from 3 to 18.
I asked Lewis if the sweets had changed much since Cecilia first saw them.
So it's still all the same headlines in terms of the water percentage. Initially they had sugar in, but we've now made them sugar-free, vegan, that has a shelf life that means it doesn't need to be kept in the fridge.
And how about the box?
So all the key features that were designed to help people engage with the product have remained. But when my initial prototype, I vacuum formed it with some really thick plastic, and it was more of a permanent box. Now this box is made of recyclable materials that can be pulled apart easily.
And how many drops are in a box?
24 drops in a box, well, that contains 300 ml.
And so how much do the jelly drops cost?
So if you were to buy 1 pack, they're currently $7.99, but if you were to get a subscription, that comes down to $5.70.
Lewis says a tray is equivalent in price to a nice box of chocolates, although I noticed their website recommends a subscription for 1 tray a day, and that would cost nearly £50 a week. Still, it's a price many seem willing to pay. What's been the response to the product since it's been available for sale?
It's been fantastic. We've produced over 1 million drops. I know that. I guess if I was quick at maths, I'd divide that by 24.
Don't worry guys, I have done the maths, and 1 million drops is just over 40,000 boxes. Sadly, Lewis's grandma Pat, who first inspired the product, passed away earlier this year. But it's now being tried out by other patients with dementia across a number of care homes in the UK. I spoke to Paul Turvey, a manager at a care home run by the company Majesticare. They've been buying them for some of their residents.
5 residents actually taken part in the trial. So we have one lady here, she's 100 years old, and she is living with a dementia. And we have found the jelly drops really, really useful with this lady because she becomes quite anxious around accepting fluid because of associating that with the need to pass urine. So she would often decline, refuse fluid because of that negative connotation. But the jelly drops have been amazing in helping reduce that anxiety for her. She can get through a tray of 24 a day easily.
Jelly drops also won an Innovation Award at the 2020 National Dementia Care Awards. They're currently only available in the UK, but Lewis says they have plans to start shipping abroad, starting with the US in 2021. Now, in our first episode of 2020, we visited a pharmacist in Amsterdam called Marleen.
We were a bit upset and we were searching for solutions. And as a pharmacist, I thought, well, maybe we can do it ourselves.
She was angry that a pharma company had hiked up the cost of a drug for a rare disease, making it too expensive for her patients. Her solution? To make the pills herself. Charlotte Horn went along to investigate, and she joins us now. Charlotte, can you remind us what happened?
Sure. So the pharmacist at the centre of the story is Marleen Kemper, who works for the Amsterdam University Medical Center. She'd been treating patients who have a rare metabolic disease with a drug called CDCA, a medicine originally developed to treat gallstones.
So what was the problem?
3 years ago, an Italian pharmaceutical company re-registered this drug with the European Medicines Agency as an official treatment for this rare metabolic disease. It meant no other company could manufacture CDCA in the EU for 10 years. But just after Leadiant re-registered the drug, they increased the price from around 30,000 euros per year to 150,000 euros.
That's 5 times as much.
I know, but the pharma company, Leadiant, said they'd done further tests and upgraded both the ingredients and the manufacturing process of their version of the drug. And this was done at substantial cost. The Dutch insurance companies refused to pay the new price, leaving patients in the lurch.
So what did Marleen do?
She realized there was a loophole. EU rules allow pharmacists to make a prescribed drug on a small scale for their patients. So Marleen worked out what the ingredients were and found a company in China that was willing to sell them to her. Then she got to work, pressing the powder into capsules. So it's really hand manufacturing.
In one day we can do the preparation of CDCA for, I think, 5-6 patients.
It looks like a tiny chessboard. It's got with all these holes in the middle, and it looks a little bit like back in the day when we were children and to press a flower, you know?
Yeah, and it's something like that.
Her team produced the capsules for their 50 patients for 5 months until August 2018. But then, Leadiant asked for an inspection of Marleen's lab. The Dutch Health Inspectorate found an impurity above the permitted level of 0.25%.
So what impact did that have?
Marleen's team had to stop production and call up all their patients asking for the capsules back.
That must have been so difficult.
When we called the patients, that was very hard, especially the first one.
When we left the story, the Dutch insurance companies were paying for the Leadiant capsules as a stopgap. Marleen had vowed to keep fighting for an affordable version.
Okay, so I'm dying to know, what did Marleen do next?
Well, Marleen and her team didn't give up. They spent months looking for a new supplier of the key ingredients, and they finally found another one in Asia. Marleen told me they did lots of tests on the raw material to make sure the quality was right this time.
We did some extra work, and at that moment we informed the Dutch Inspectorate and they asked us for our dossier and we sent it to them. Then they had some questions. We answered the questions and they said, well, you've provided correct answers and good luck. And then we decided that we could inform our patients and start providing them with our own product.
So how did patients react when Marleen rang them this time?
Well, I caught up with Geya, who I interviewed for the original program. Her son has the rare condition, and she had been worried about how long the insurers would keep paying for the Leadiant drug.
I was a bit shocked because I didn't expect it, and then very relieved because I was hoping for it, of course, but and I was also expecting that she would be able to do it again, but you never know when, or so it was great news. It has given me a lot more peace of mind. It's going well now, so I don't think about it as much and I don't worry about it as much, but I still worry about it a little bit because I don't think it's the real solution.
Is Geya worried Marleen might be stopped from producing the drug again?
Yes, and Marleen is worried too. She's been very careful to keep the details of her manufacture in Asia under wraps. She doesn't want anyone to buy it up and disrupt her supply chain.
So it's good news for now, but it's not a permanent solution.
Exactly. The bigger problem of pharma companies hiking up the price of old and modified drugs for rare diseases hasn't gone away. The European Commission has promised to look again at the legislation on this subject, although not until 2022. But in the meantime, Marleen and her team have started a foundation called Medicine for Society with funding from the Dutch lottery. They are supporting research to make affordable drugs available for patients with rare diseases. And Marleen has a message for pharmacists from around the world.
One thing, I think it's important that if colleagues who want to cooperate or have an idea or are struggling with things, that they can, give us a call or send an email, whatever they want. Hopefully we are able to help.
That's great to hear, Charlotte. Thank you for the update.
Thanks, Claire.
Now, at the very start of this programme, we played you a clip from Fia in Sweden, who was really struggling with loneliness. She had joined a housing experiment where people signed a contract promising to spend at least 2 hours a week socialising with their neighbours. The residents were a mix of young and old. Maddie Savage went to visit a year ago when it just opened, and she joins us now. Maddie, can you remind us, what was it like?
So this apartment block used to be a care home for elderly people, but it had been transformed with every little detail designed to encourage mingling. There's a shared gym, library, cooking areas, an arts and crafts room, although people have their own separate apartments and kitchens too. The project's called Cellbo, which combines the Swedish words for companionship, sällskap, and living, bo, and it's only open to pensioners and under 25-year-olds after a Swedish housing company became worried that these were the loneliest groups of tenants. One of the first people I met was 20-year-old Fia, and she said she had almost no social life before she moved in.
I went to work, I went home, and I played on my computer and went to bed. That was my day. It was lonely. When I didn't talk to my friends, it was really, really lonely.
Well, within a few weeks at Cellbo, she'd already made plenty of friends. She introduced me to one of the other younger residents.
Hello, this is Rasmus. We have a lot of hobbies that are the same, and 10 minutes and we be friends.
Clicked instantly,
yes.
Basically. We really like games together, anime.
Tell us a bit about yourself, Rasmus.
Yeah, I'm 22 years old, and I really love it here. I really like the concept. All the other activities around here in all the different rooms, and kind of meet people like that.
And Fia also formed a strong relationship with Gunnel, who's in her late 80s. Trevliga träffas, lovely to meet you.
Okay, come in.
And why did you move in here, Gunnel?
I was so lonely. After my husband died, silence was overwhelming. And it couldn't pass days when I didn't talk to anyone. And I became a bit odd. And then I was out on the net and I saw this Cellbo. I said, that seems to be something to do about it.
How does it feel so far?
I met some people and above all I met Fia. And that made my weeks here, I must say.
So it sounds like it was working well.
Yeah, around 70 residents moved in, and the project's organisers said everyone ended up socialising, even more than they expected.
Now, that was a year ago, and of course not long after that, the COVID pandemic hit Europe.
Yes, in March. That was when Sweden had its first COVID death, and the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus outbreak was officially a pandemic.
So now there's a situation where some of the people who are the most vulnerable to COVID, those over 70, are living side by side with younger people. Did they have to rethink the contract, which was to socialise?
They did. They asked people not to have their usual indoor get-togethers, and I found out that was challenging at first. People wanted to keep socialising, especially the older residents.
Hi, my name is Dragana Curovic, and I'm the project manager of the concept of Cellbo in Sweden. We tried to be the bad guy, you can't socialize, please keep distance and things like that. But it went very well. The youngsters kept themselves away as much as possible. They helped the elderly in buying food and groceries to drive them outside the city so they can be in nature and not meet other people. They pretty much became as a family.
So nice to hear that. And young people being able to run errands was really important because although Sweden's never had a formal lockdown, its advice for older people has mostly been to stay home and try and get others to shop for them. So living at Sällbo made that a lot easier.
So although they couldn't socialise like before, the community acted like a support network.
Exactly. There's a big garden too, so people were able to get fresh air or have some socially distanced get-togethers like picnics and barbecues when the weather was warmer without leaving the complex. I caught up with Fia's friend Rasmus, who's 22, and he said some of the younger residents have found it hard to limit their socialising both in and outside the building in order to protect the older ones, but he said he'd still rather be at Sällbo than in a normal apartment block right now.
Even though the pandemic has made it a bit different than what it may have been, I still think that it has worked. I feel that I always have someone to talk to. I can basically knock on any door, and one, I know the person behind the door, and two, I know that they will most likely be able to help me and want to help me, and that is quite comforting.
He told me Fia and Gunnel are happy and healthy as well. When it comes to COVID-19 cases, he said there have been a couple recently and those people have been self-isolating. But Dragana and the team are really proud that Sällbo managed to make it from March to November without any confirmed infections.
So what's next for Sällbo?
The project's only got funding from the local municipality for the next year or so, but Dragana is hopeful that it can continue. She says similar projects are being planned by several other Swedish regions, and Sällbo is also part of a major study by housing and social work researchers at nearby Lund University. They've been following the project closely for a year, and they're going to report back on the impact of Sällbo, both on social integration and the environment. And it's not just Swedes who are fascinated by this project.
Other cities will start to have Sällbos because we see the benefit of this kind of living.
And I guess all the people living in Sällbo will be hoping for the chance to have a big party once the pandemic's over and everyone's got access to vaccines.
Exactly, it's spot on. The big party is the dream everybody dreams about.
And there are hopes they won't have to wait too long for it. Sweden has committed to buying several different vaccines and it aims to start immunising the over 70s from January.
Well, let's hope they have a fantastic big bash once the world's got to grips with COVID. Thanks very much, Maddie.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today. We hope you've enjoyed catching up with some inspiring innovators here at People Fixing the World. Next week, Anna will be here to talk about donut economics. Anna, I've got to admit, I have never heard of this. What is it?
So it's all about answering a rather complex question. Is there a way for us to live without destroying the world? Kate Raworth is a British economist and she's come up with a concept which she believes offers a solution. And it's all based around a donut.
A donut?
Yes. Here's Kate to explain.
So the donut, silly though it sounds, is a picture of 21st century prosperity for humanity. It's vision for where we want to get to this century. And imagine a donut, the kind with a hole in the middle. So the goal is to leave nobody in that hole in the middle falling short on the essentials of life, like without the food, water and healthcare and housing and political voice. But at the same time, we can't overshoot the outer crust of the donut, that outer ring, because there we put so much pressure on our planetary home.
So it's basically all about living within those boundaries inside the sweet spot of the donut.
And is there a way to test this theory?
Well, that's exactly what we wanted to explore, whether it offers real-life, tangible solutions. So Amsterdam's the first city in the world to officially adopt the donut model. I went to see 3 projects there: a food rescue warehouse, a fashion company, and a whole district that's built on these sustainable principles to basically see whether a donut really can save the planet.
I'm really looking forward to seeing how that one works out, Anna. But for now, from all of the team, goodbye and wishing you a very happy new year.
This is the BBC World Service, and here's what World Book Club have been reading.
Reykjavik has undergone a transformation. An ominous hush lies over the busiest...
I'm Harriet Gilbert, and we've been reading a novel published 7 years ago, but uncannily prophetic. A story of love and cinema set during the 1918 flu pandemic.
It was one of those rare moments in history where everything seems to happen at the same time.
The book's called Moonstone, The Boy Who Never Was, by the Icelandic author Sjón.
All of a sudden, this book mirrors the direct experience of people today.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how you prepared to write this book?
I thought it was a powerful and vibrant story.
Are you inspired by old movies?
What I always try to do in my writing is to acknowledge that reality exists on different levels for all of us.
World Book Club with Sjón, Sunday at 14 GMT.
You're listening to the BBC World Service with me, Elizabeth Hotson. In today's Business Daily, we'll be asking how our eating habits have changed during a year when lockdowns have seen more of us cooking at home and fewer of us sharing meals out with colleagues. And can Zoom calls replace the networking coffee or dinner? That's all coming up after the latest world news.
BBC News with Danielle Yawowiecka. Republicans in the US House of Representatives have joined Democrats to reject President Trump's veto of a defense bill. The Senate will vote on the measure on Tuesday. It could, with a 2/3 majority, override Mr. Trump's presidential veto for the first time. The bill would lead to the removal of Confederate generals' names from US military bases. The Bangladeshi Navy says an operation has begun to ferry a further 1,800 Rohingyas to a low-lying island in the Bay of Bengal. They had been living in camps in southern Bangladesh since fleeing ethnic violence in Myanmar. Bangladesh wants to relocate about 100,000 refugees to the island. The Ministry of Defence in Britain says 1,500 military personnel will be deployed to support the implementation of coronavirus testing in English schools and colleges. 6 people who travelled to India from the UK have tested positive for the new variant of coronavirus first identified in Britain. The Indian government says they are now in isolation. The media watchdog Reporters Without Borders says that 50 journalists were killed in connection with their work in 2020. Most were in countries not at war. Journalists are increasingly targeted over investigations into corruption, organised crime or climate concerns. Prince Charles has told the BBC he now sees the private sector as critical towards solutions to climate change. He said the world was facing a real emergency. The heir to the British throne said people once thought he was completely dotty when he raised environmental issues, but he added that times had changed. And tributes have been paid to the renowned Mexican singer-songwriter Armando Manzanera, who died on Monday aged 85. The Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador cut short a news conference to show a video which featured the musician. He hailed him as a great composer. That's the latest BBC News.
I'm Elizabeth Hotson, and in today's Business Daily, I'll be finding out how our eating habits have changed during the coronavirus pandemic.
There's something so lovely about being able to walk into a space and to know that you're being cared for, that you don't have to do that dish after, and now it's just sort of full on, and all in a small space.
And why there's a light at the end of the tunnel for restaurants.
What I miss most is eating with people. Breaking bread with people forms a bond, and that's the biggest thing I miss.
This is Business Daily from the BBC.
I do not enjoy being in the kitchen. In fact, I abhor being in the kitchen. My idea of cooking is my French press. You know, I'm the ultimate New Yorker in that sense. I do like to make eggs, but I've realized over months that making eggs is not going to sustain me. And I can roast vegetables, which I don't think is cooking, but that's the extent of it.
Erin Allwise is the founder of the Number 29 PR agency. She lives in New York, and before coronavirus, eating out was just part and parcel of life.
Oh my gosh, I'm sort of embarrassed for myself, but I ate out daily. I often would wake up. Sometimes I would make coffee, but there was something about the ritual of going to my local coffee shop and just sitting there before starting the day. And then I would probably bring something with me for breakfast. I would either pick up lunch, or I would go out and meet somebody else for lunch. I joke that restaurants are both my kitchen, but also my office. And then dinner, I would probably go to a restaurant just because, again, it was like the only time you could see your friends. We live in small apartments, so there are fewer dinner parties.